The summer of 1977 began with a heat wave that felt like a heavy, wet blanket draped over the 5 boroughs. In Bushwick, the air was so thick with humidity that you could almost taste the salt and exhaust. Everyone stayed outside on their porches because the brick apartments had turned into ovens. Radios were blasting salsa and disco music, creating a chaotic symphony that defined the neighborhood. But beneath the music, there was a simmering frustration fueled by poverty and the relentless sun. I remember watching a fire hydrant spray water into the street as kids screamed with joy. Then, at exactly 9:34 p.m., the music didn't just stop, it vanished. Every street lamp and neon sign in the city blinked out of existence in a single heartbeat. A heavy, unnatural silence fell over the block as the hum of refrigerators and air conditioners died. People began to mutter and call out to one another, their voices tight with uncertainty. Within minutes, the initial shock transformed into a restless, jagged energy. Someone shouted that the whole city was down and that the cops were spread too thin. The first sound of breaking glass echoed through the canyon of buildings like a gunshot. I saw a group of men running toward the appliance store on the corner with crowbars in hand. The metal security gate was ripped upward with a screeching groan that set my teeth on edge. Suddenly, the darkness wasn't just empty, it was alive with the sound of looting. Smoke began to curl from the top floor of a nearby tenement building. An arsonist had set a pile of trash on fire and the flames were climbing the fire escape. I could hear the roar of the fire growing louder, drowning out the shouts of the looters. Leo grabbed my arm and told me we had to get back to my mother's apartment. We tried to navigate the sidewalk, but it was blocked by people hauling furniture into the street. A man with a bandana over his face bumped into me, knocking me toward the gutter. The heat from the growing fires made it hard to breathe, turning the night air into a furnace. Every few blocks, a car alarm would join the chorus of sirens and screams. We finally reached my building only to find the lobby filled with thick gray smoke. The fire from the building next door had spread through the shared basement. We couldn't use the stairs because the heat was rising like a chimney. I remembered my little sister was still inside our 4th-floor apartment. Without thinking, I ran toward the rusted fire escape on the side of the building. Leo hesitated for a second before following me up the shaky metal structure. The metal groaned under our weight, sounding like it was about to snap off the wall. As we climbed, I could see the chaos of the city expanding in every direction. It looked like a war zone with pillars of fire marking the locations of stores being gutted. We reached the 3rd floor, but the window above us suddenly shattered outward. A blast of heat hit me in the face, nearly knocking me off the narrow platform. I could hear my sister screaming my name from somewhere deep inside the smoke. I clawed at the window frame, my fingers burning against the hot metal. Below us, a mob had gathered and started throwing bottles at the building. One of the bottles smashed against the brick right next to Leo's head. The entire fire escape suddenly shifted an inch away from the wall with a sickening metallic snap. The metal structure groaned as the bolts holding the top landing to the brickwork snapped under the sudden weight. Oscar grabbed my arm with a grip so tight it left bruises, his eyes wide with the realization of the height. Below us, the alleyway was a dark abyss, illuminated only by the rhythmic flashing of distant, powerless sirens. A sudden blast of heat erupted from the window we had just climbed out of, singing the back of my neck. Mr. Ortiz, a retired cop from the 4th floor, pushed his way through the crowding bodies to take command. He shouted for everyone to keep their weight to the inside of the stairs, closer to the sturdy wall. We moved like a slow, heavy snake down the metal slats, every footstep echoing like a gunshot in the alley. A mother 2 levels below us began to scream that her baby was struggling to breathe in the thick soot. The flow of people ground to a halt as an elderly woman near the bottom tripped, her leg caught in the gap. Realizing the danger of the bottleneck, Mr. Ortiz organized a human chain to pass the infant down safely. Oscar took the baby first, his hands shaking as he cradled the tiny, crying life. I reached out to take the child from him, my palms sweaty and my heart hammering against my ribs. I passed the bundle to a man below me, feeling a momentary surge of purpose amidst the chaos. A loud crack sounded from the building's facade as more brickwork crumbled under the heat of the fire. The crowd surged forward again, pushing us dangerously close to the rusted outer railing. I kept my eyes on the heels of the person in front of me, trying to block out the screams from the street. Below us, Broadway was a river of violence as looters smashed through the glass of the meat market. The smell of burning rubber and rotten meat wafted up, mixing with the metallic scent of old rust. We reached the final ladder, which was stuck in its housing, rusted shut by years of neglect. Men from the street grabbed the bottom of the ladder, pulling it down with a screech that set my teeth on edge. One by one, we tumbled onto the hard concrete, gasping for air that didn't taste like ash. We turned back to see Oscar's third-floor window explode outward as the fire found a new source of oxygen. He stood there, the orange light dancing in his tear-filled eyes as his entire childhood turned to smoke. Around the corner, the sound of a mob grew louder, chanting and smashing everything in their path. Mr. Ortiz ushered us toward the opposite end of the block, away from the main surge of the riots. Every shadow seemed to hold a predator, and every sound made us jump in fear of being spotted. We saw a group of men dragging a heavy safe across the pavement, the metal sparking against the asphalt. The heat of the night was stifling, a 100-degree fever that the city couldn't break. We reached the edge of my block where neighbors stood on stoops with baseball bats to guard their homes. My mother was waiting at our gate, her face a mask of terror that dissolved into relief when she saw me. Oscar stood apart from the embrace, looking back toward the pillars of smoke rising from his own street. He told my mother that they had lost everything, his voice sounding older than any 13-year-old should. We spent the rest of the night on our living room floor listening to the battery-powered radio report on the fall of the city. The announcer spoke of 30 blocks of stores gutted on Broadway and thousands of arrests being made. When the sun finally rose, it didn't bring hope, only a clearer view of the devastation. We walked back to Oscar's block and saw the National Guard setting up perimeters around the charred remains of the buildings. Oscar found his parents by a hydration station, their reunion a chorus of sobbing in the middle of the street. The lights came back on late that next night, but the sense of safety we once felt was gone forever. As the 1970s faded into history, that night remained a scar on the soul of everyone who lived through it. But the darkness that swallowed New York was merely a precursor to a much larger collapse elsewhere. Years later, and thousands of miles away, a different kind of shadow began to stretch over the city of Caracas. In a small pharmacy on the corner, a man named Mariana's father heard a rhythmic tapping against his metal shutters. The tapping turned into a heavy pounding, signaling that the rules of the world had changed once again. Behind the counter, the pharmacist reached for a heavy slab of steel, his eyes fixed on the breaking door. As the first shutter link snapped, a voice from the darkness outside whispered a demand that would lead to a bloody confrontation. My name is Mariana, and though I live in Argentina now, my heart remains tethered to the vibrant chaos of Caracas. Growing up in the 2000s, our district was a cramped, loud symphony of passion, music, and the incredible aroma of home-cooked food. At the center of it all was my father's pharmacy, a small corner shop that served as the beating heart of our entire community. He knew everyone's name, from the young mothers buying formula to the grandmothers seeking their monthly blood pressure medication. My father wasn't just a pharmacist, he was a confidant who offered advice for everything from a stubborn cough to a broken heart. On Sundays, he would close the shop early and take us to the coast, where the air smelled of salt and fried arepas. We would spend hours at Coroni laughing with cousins as the sun dipped low and the mountains turned purple. But as I turned 14, the energy of the country began to shift into something unrecognizable and cold. Inflation hit like a tidal wave, turning yesterday's savings into today's pocket change overnight. For the first time, I heard my parents arguing at the dinner table about how to stretch the remaining food. My father told me to stop wandering the streets I had played on all my life because they were no longer safe. Running the pharmacy became a daily battle against scarcity and heavy-handed government regulations. He would come home with stories of patients who simply couldn't afford the pills they needed to stay alive. Then came March 7th, 2019, the day the pulse of the nation finally stopped. At 5 p.m., the electricity died across the entire country, from the capital to the smallest mountain village. We were used to blackouts, but as the hours turned into a full night, a heavy silence settled over the city. The government broadcasted claims of a sabotage attack on the Guri Dam by foreign militaries, but no one believed them. We knew the system had simply rotted away from years of neglect. Chilling reports began to surface from the hospitals where the darkness was claiming lives. With generators failing, doctors were forced to hook medical machines up to car batteries in the parking lots. Babies in incubators were at risk, and surgeries were halted mid-procedure as the fuel ran dry. Demonstrations erupted the next day, but the riot police responded with force instead of solutions. The government promised the power would return within 24 hours, but that was just another lie. Food began to rot in refrigerators and the water pump stopped, leaving us without a drop to drink. The streets clogged with thousands of people walking miles to their homes as the metro system remained dead. By the third day, the atmosphere shifted from frustration to a predatory desperation. In cities like Maracaibo, it looked like the end of the world as mobs stormed shopping districts. They weren't just taking food, they were grabbing furniture and electronics to trade for water and fuel. Families guarded their doors with machetes and hammers, praying the violence wouldn't reach their block. We heard gunshots echoing through the night air, followed by the acrid smell of tear gas drifting in. On the fourth day, the rumor we feared most reached my father. A local gang was planning to hit our pharmacy. My father knew the police were too busy protecting the wealthy districts to care about our corner store. Instead of panicking, he began a series of meticulous and strange preparations throughout the building. He welded straps to a slab of construction steel, creating a makeshift shield he hoped would stop a bullet. At midnight, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy banging against our metal shutters. 6 men worked in the shadows below, using crowbars to pry open the sanctuary of our home. My father took his position on the stairs, crouching behind his steel shield like a warrior from another era. He gave them one warning to leave, but they only laughed and told him to go back to bed so they could work in peace. My father whispered a single phrase in Spanish, "So be it," and reached for a glass jar he had prepared. As the first shutter link snapped, a voice from the darkness outside whispered a demand that would lead to a bloody confrontation. The voice from the darkness outside was low, gravelly, and carried the weight of a death sentence. Elena huddled behind the prescription counter, her breath hitching as the metal groaned again. My father did not speak, but his hands moved with a precision I had only seen during complex compounding. He knew the medicine in these cabinets was worth more than gold in a city without power. Another heavy blow struck the front gate, sending a shower of rust and paint chips onto the floor. Father grabbed a bottle of high-concentration isopropyl alcohol and a box of potassium permanganate. He wasn't just a pharmacist anymore, he was an alchemist preparing for a siege. He began to spread a slippery, caustic slurry across the tiled floor just inside the entrance. The smell of bleach and sulfur began to fill the stagnant hot air of the shop. Outside, the shouting grew louder as more men joined the effort to tear the shop open. Father climbed a small ladder and perched a heavy glass jar filled with acid above the doorframe. He rigged a thin copper wire to the jar, connecting it to the handle of the rolling gate. "Don't look, Elena," he whispered, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. Suddenly, a crowbar jammed into the gap at the bottom of the shutter and began to pry. With a deafening screech of protesting steel, the bottom pins of the gate snapped. The shutter flew upward and 3 large men stumbled into the trap. The lead intruder's feet hit the chemical slurry, and he went down instantly. As the gate hit the top of its track, The copper wire pulled the jar from the ledge. The glass shattered against the second man's shoulder, drenching him in a corrosive yellow fluid. A scream ripped through the silence of the blackout, more animal than human. Father stepped out from the shadows of the insulin fridge, holding a pressurized garden sprayer. He pumped the handle once and unleashed a fine mist of pepper-infused alcohol. The third man, who had stayed on his feet, began to cough violently and clawed his throat. "Leave now, or the next mixture will be the last thing you ever smell," Father commanded. The intruders scrambled over each other, dragging their burned companion back out into the street. Father immediately moved to the broken shutter and began to pull it down manually. He used a heavy chain and several industrial padlocks to secure the damaged tracks. He looked at Elena, and for a moment the warrior mask slipped to reveal his heartbreak. "I never wanted you to see your father like this," he whispered into the gloom. But Elena saw something else. She saw a man who would rewrite the laws of nature to keep her safe. The night was far from over, and the sound of distant gunfire began to echo through the valley. Father returned to his bench and began to prepare a second, more potent batch of deterrent. He knew the gang would return with more men and more rage. He began to sharpen a long piece of rebar he had salvaged from the back alley. The pharmacy had become a sanctuary of science in a world that had reverted to the Middle Ages. Every hour that passed without power made the people outside less like neighbors and more like wolves. Father set a timer on his old mechanical watch to wake him every 20 minutes. Elena tried to sleep on a pile of lab coats, but every creak of the building made her jump. Towards dawn, a heavy truck rumbled to a stop directly in front of the shop. As the engine cut out, the silence was replaced by the metallic shick-shick of a shotgun being racked. Father stood up, his hand hovering over a final unmarked canister that he had hoped he would never have to use. Father stood up, his hand hovering over a final unmarked canister that he had hoped he would never have to use. Long before that night of fire and chemical defense, my mind drifts to the vibrant, stacked hillsides of Rio de Janeiro. In 1999, Babylonia was a place of extreme contrast perched directly above the wealthy mansions of the Lemay district. As a teenager, I remember the sound of laughter echoing through the narrow alleys as kids played football on concrete pitches. We were poor in money but rich in spirit, finding joy under the flickering orange glow of the streetlights. However, the favela was a world governed by two different powers depending on the position of the sun. During the day, the politicians and police maintained a facade of order, but at night, the rules changed completely. When the sun vanished, the police retreated to their safe homes, leaving the gangs to take charge of the shadows. On bad nights, the rhythmic popping of gunfire replaced the music, sounding like deadly fireworks across the hillside. You learned early to keep your head down and never wander into different neighborhoods after the stars appeared. But March 11th, 1999 was a date that would reset the rules of the street in a way no one expected. It was a Thursday night, and I was at home looking after my little brother while our mother visited a friend. At exactly 10:16 p.m., a massive lightning bolt slammed into a substation in Bauru, hundreds of miles away. Like falling dominoes, the entire power grid of southern Brazil collapsed in a matter of seconds. I walked out onto our small balcony and saw that the entire world had been plunged into a deep, unnatural silence. Even the traffic lights were dead, leaving the roads below as dark rivers of unmoving metal. People began calling out to one another in the dark, their voices filled with a mix of excitement and growing worry. While blackouts weren't rare, the atmosphere this time felt heavy, like a storm that refused to break. An hour passed without a single police siren or emergency light appearing anywhere near our hillside. We heard reports on the radio that the police were overwhelmed, focused entirely on protecting the luxury stores downtown. I became terrified for my mother and decided to leave my little brother asleep to go find her at her friend's house. Outside, the streets felt like a strange carnival at first, with people cracking open beers and dancing by flashlight. The celebration was a thin mask for the fear that the gangs were already coordinating their next moves. Rival crews, who had been eyeing each other for weeks, saw the lack of police as an invitation to war. I found my mother, but within 5 minutes the first sharp cracks of automatic weapons tore through the air. My mother told me to stay put, but the guilt of leaving my brother alone in that war zone was more than I could bear. I bolted from the house and began a blind run through the darkness toward our home. The sound of bullets hitting metal roofs was like thunder, and the muzzle flashes lit up the night like hellfire. I saw people charging down alleys, spraying bullets wildly and dropping bodies in the crossfire. I watched a boy from my school get cut down in his white shirt, the fabric turning black as he collapsed. 2 gangs clashed at a corner, barking orders at each other from behind a barricade of wrecked cars. The air smelled of gunpowder and ozone, and every gunshot made my shadow jump in front of me. I had to get back to my brother. I didn't care if I died trying to reach him. I tripped over a man moaning on the ground and realized the blackout had turned my home into a total war zone. Suddenly, a man standing in a doorway called out to me, offering me shelter from the flying bullets. I ran to him and he slammed the door shut, locking out the screams and the sounds of automatic fire. He seemed kind at first, giving me water and telling me he knew my family from around the neighborhood. But then his hand lingered on my shoulder too long and his grip began to tighten in a way that made my skin crawl. He whispered for me to relax and stay put, and a new kind of terror, different from the bullets, hit me like a truck. I shoved him off with all my strength and bolted back out into the night, preferring the gang war to that house. Tears blurred my vision as I ran blind, dodging gunfights where gangs were unloading clips into the black void. I finally reached my home and burst through the door, sprinting up the stairs to the room I shared with my brother. I found him huddled under a blanket, his voice gone from crying so much in the absolute darkness. We cried together as I held him tight, whispering apologies over and over for leaving him behind. That night taught me that in a crisis, the world becomes a place that children cannot understand and should never have to see. But as the sun rose over the broken streets of Rio, a new shadow was falling across a quiet home in New Delhi. The heavy silence of the blackout was shattered by the first sharp crack of a distant rifle. I looked back at my mother's worried face, knowing I had left Gabriel all alone in the dark. Without another word, I bolted from the safety of the house and sprinted into the abyss. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the ozone of the recent storm. Suddenly, a series of orange flashes lit up the end of the block like a hellish disco. I dove behind a rusted-out car as bullets pinged against the metal frame above my head. A group of men with rifles ran past my hiding spot, their heavy boots thudding on the concrete. I saw a body slump against a colorful wall, the white of his shirt turning instantly dark. I didn't wait to see if he was alive. I crawled forward on my hands and knees. The screaming of a woman nearby pierced through the relentless rattle of gunfire. I reached a major intersection where 2 gangs were trading volleys from behind makeshift barricades. I timed the rhythm of the shots and waited for a momentary lull to cross. My heart hammered against my ribs as I sprinted across the open asphalt. A bullet struck a metal pole just inches from my head, ringing like a death knell. I tumbled into a dark doorway, gasping for air as the shooting intensified behind me. A man's hand reached out from the darkness and pulled me further inside. The man spoke in a calm, soothing voice, telling me he knew my father. But as he patted my shoulder, his grip lingered a second too long. He pulled me closer, whispering that I should stay until the sun came up. I saw the predatory look in his eyes and felt a different kind of terror than the gunfire. I shoved him back with all my strength and bolted for the front door. I burst back into the war zone, preferring the random bullets to that man's touch. I ran blindly now, my lungs burning with every gasping breath. I tripped over something soft and heard a groan of pain from the ground. It was a man clutching his side, his hands slick with a dark liquid in the moonlight. "I'm sorry," I whispered before scrambling up and continuing my flight. My own street was finally in sight, but it was occupied by a group of armed teens. I climbed a low wall and navigated the interconnected rooftops of my neighbors. The metal groaned under my weight, sounding like a gunshot in the still night. I reached our small balcony and slipped through the door like a shadow. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound being the distant pop of small arms fire. I crept up the stairs, my heart in my throat, praying I wasn't too late. I pushed open the bedroom door and saw a small shape huddled under the covers. Gabriel looked up, his face stained with tears and his eyes red from crying. He lunged at me, wrapping his small arms around my neck in a death grip. I held him tight, whispering over and over that I was so sorry for leaving. Outside, the war in the streets continued to rage, indifferent to our small reunion. I sat with my back against the door, holding a heavy metal pipe I found in the corner. The blackout had stripped away the thin veil of civilization, leaving only predators and prey. We survived the night in Rio, but thousands of miles away, another predator was already choosing his victim in the shadows of New Delhi. The humid air of New Delhi hung heavy over the suburbs as the clock struck noon on July 30th, 2012. Without warning, the rhythmic hum of millions of air conditioners vanished into a deafening silence. For Priya, a 24-year-old architecture student, the sudden quiet felt like a physical weight against her chest. She didn't know yet that the largest power failure in human history had just crippled half of India. Her first instinct was to check the phone line, but the handset yielded only a hollow, dead static. Outside her window, the neighborhood began to stir with the confused murmurs of thousands of people spilling into the streets. In the shadows of a nearby alley, a man named Ravi watched Priya's apartment building with predatory patience. He had been stalking her for months, his obsession fueled by a rejection she had long since forgotten. To Ravi, the blackout wasn't a crisis, but a divine intervention that had finally extinguished the city's watchful eyes. Priya's younger brother, Rohan, clutched her arm as the sun began its final descent behind the concrete jungle. She told him to help her gather every candle and flashlight they owned before the twilight completely vanished. As the last of the natural light died, New Delhi transformed into a void of ink and whispers. Priya noticed a flicker of movement near the perimeter wall of their compound through the gaps in the balcony railing. A silhouette was moving with unnatural purpose, staying low and hugging the shadows of the parked cars. She quickly ushered Rohan into the hallway and whispered for him to stay absolutely quiet. Downstairs, Ravi reached the service entrance and found the electronic lock useless without power. He stepped into the stairwell, his heavy boots making no sound on the concrete as he began his ascent. Priya heard the faint, rhythmic metallic click of the stairwell door opening 3 floors below. She rushed to the front door and slid the heavy iron bolt into place, her hands trembling violently. She checked the secondary locks, realization dawning that her parents wouldn't be home for hours due to the gridlock. Outside on the landing, Ravi paused at door 4B, listening to the frantic breathing on the other side. He didn't knock. Instead, he began to lean his weight against the wood, testing the strength of the frame. Priya grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the side table and retreated further into the dark apartment. "Rohan, get under the bed and don't make a sound until I tell you," she hissed in a cracked voice. A sharp, splintering sound echoed through the flat as Ravi began to kick the door near the lock. Each strike felt like a hammer against her own skull, vibrating through the floorboards under her bare feet. Through the wood, Ravi's voice came out in a low, distorted croon, calling her name like a lullaby. Priya realized the front door wouldn't hold much longer and looked toward the narrow stone staircase leading to the roof. She sprinted to Rohan's room, grabbed him by the waist, and pulled him toward the kitchen. The front door finally gave way with a thunderous crash, the iron bolt tearing through the masonry. Priya scrambled up the steep roof stairs, her lungs burning as she dragged Rohan behind her. Ravi stepped into the living room, his eyes scanning the empty space with a hunter's precision. He saw the open roof door in the kitchen and let out a small, wet chuckle that chilled the air. On the flat stone roof, Priya frantically looked for a place to hide amidst the water tanks and satellite dishes. She pushed Rohan into the narrow gap behind a massive black plastic water cistern. She followed him, pressing her back against the cold plastic, holding her breath until her ribs ached. The heavy metal door to the roof creaked open, and the sound of Ravi's footsteps on the stone was like thunder. A beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping over the laundry lines and concrete edges. Ravi walked slowly toward the water tanks, the light bouncing closer and closer to their hiding spot. Priya closed her eyes and felt the heat of the flashlight beam hit the edge of the tank just inches from her face. Priya lay flat against the rough stone of the roof, her chest heaving as she tried to keep her breathing silent. Just inches away, the beam of a flashlight cut through the dark, sweeping across the edge of the roof ledge. She reached out a trembling hand and pressed it firmly over Arjun's mouth to ensure he wouldn't make a sound. Below them, the sound of heavy boots stomped through the bedroom they had just escaped. Rajesh's voice echoed through the open window, filled with a venomous rage that made Priya shiver. The dresser they had used as a barricade was shoved aside with a violent scraping sound. Priya closed her eyes and prayed to every god she knew, hoping the darkness would remain their shield. She couldn't have gone far. One of the other men growled, his voice uncomfortably close to the window. The cold stone bit into Priya's knees where she had scraped them while climbing out. Arjun gripped the small kitchen knife so tightly that his knuckles turned white in the gloom. Inside the house, the sound of breaking pottery and overturning furniture signaled the intruder's frustration. A flashlight beam suddenly shot upward, illuminating the soot-stained sky just above their heads. Priya felt a drop of cold rain hit her cheek, but she dared not even wipe it away. Rajesh spat a curse into the air, his shadow dancing wildly against the interior walls. She must be hiding in the alley outside, he finally concluded, his voice fading as he moved away from the window. The heavy footsteps retreated down the stairs, followed by the sound of the front door slamming shut. Priya waited for several minutes, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The only sound was the distant hum of a city that had forgotten how to be light. Suddenly, a piercing scream erupted from the street below, but this time it was a voice they knew. Their mother had returned to find the front door wide open and the house in shambles. "Ma, we're here!" Priya cried out, finally finding her voice as she helped Arjun back through the window. They tumbled into their mother's arms, 3 figures huddled together on the floor amidst the wreckage. When their father arrived shortly after, his face hardened with a quiet, dangerous resolve. He spent the rest of the night reinforcing the door with thick wooden planks and heavy iron bolts. For the next 2 days, the family lived in a self-imposed fortress while the city remained in darkness. The silence of the blackout was now filled with the sound of their own whispered prayers. On the 3rd night, the first sign of recovery appeared as a single street lamp flickered to life in the distance. Then, with a sudden surge, the overhead lights in their living room blazed into existence. The hum of the ceiling fan felt like the most beautiful music Priya had ever heard. The police eventually arrested 2 of the men who had broken in, identifying them as local petty criminals. Though they confessed to the break-in, they refused to name Rajesh as the one who had hired them. Priya saw him days later, but instead of looking away in fear, she stared him directly in the eyes. Rajesh was the one who blinked first, turning his head away and scurrying down a side alley. Arjun's bravery during the night on the roof had transformed him from a boy into a young man in Priya's eyes. They shared a bond that only those who have faced the true darkness together can understand. Years later, as Priya looked out over the bright lights of an American city, she remembered the value of that stone roof. She continued to work hard, sending a portion of every paycheck back home to ensure her family never had to hide again. The blackouts had taught her that the loss of light reveals the true strength of the human spirit. Peace had finally replaced the terror that once haunted the corridors of her childhood home. In the end, the shadows were gone and the light remained as a permanent testament to their survival.